LBR LBO Debrief Business Climate Outlook of 2016.
So if 2016 is going to be geopolitically very active year, so what are the implications to us? And we will get back to policies during the panel discussion and what are the economic and business implications. Again, one strong message: partnerships, partnerships, and partnerships. Myanmar is forging a free trade agreement with EU and TPP and strengthening of ASEAN. And we continue to be an isolated island. I wish Dr. Harsha De Silva is here, could get some inputs for his economic diplomacy initiative. So next speaker is Dr. Nishan de Mel. Nishan is going to speak about what one can expect in Sri Lankan economy in the coming year. And with that, we will move over to, following that, we will move over to the final session of the morning. That's a panel discussion. Over to, please welcome Nishan.
LBR LBO Debrief Business Climate Outlook of 2016.
I think last year, when I spoke at this forum, the forum was titled A Macroeconomic Outlook for Sri Lanka. This year, the title of the forum has changed a little bit, and it's called A Business Outlook for 2016. Okay? Well, Business Outlook 2015 and 16. Now, I think that the macroeconomic outlook is a very significant part of the business outlook, and certainly that will form a significant part of my presentation as well. But I want to take the advice that Lakshman gave me and ensure that the presentation today is not just about the economics and economic variables, but also about the politics and the political drivers. I think the key insight is that if you want to understand the outlook for Sri Lanka, especially Sri Lanka, but it's true for most economies, that it is not adequate simply to look at the economics and what's going on in terms of economic variables. That it is important to understand the political dynamics and to understand what's going on in terms of the balance and governance of politics. And bringing these together enables us to have a clearer sense of the outlook for the country than taking any one separately. So my presentation will be in 4 parts. We'll talk about, I will motivate some of the questions on politics by talking about public finance management. And I've said that the insight there is to see how politics can trump professionalism or more technical analysis. Then we'll look at the new political and policy balance in the country. I've called it stumbling towards democracy because I want to end that on a positive note, despite the many challenges that we see in the political balance and policy balance. The third is on currency and trade management. There we've titled it The Dance of Politics and Economics, to understand how the two play together to create the results that we see, and end a little bit discussing the dynamics of the economy in terms of growth, inflation, and interest rates. But of course, that's never a perfect science. So let me jump straight in to talk about public finance management. We are in the middle of a budget discussion. And we know that budgets are not simply about giving us economic projections. It's not an accounting exercise per se. Budgets are also about governance. That is, it is the opportunity for a government to tell us or indicate to the country, to the business, to society, something important about the policy direction. It is an occasion for governments also to set up plans that are not just for 1 year, but for 3, 5, or even longer term plans. So you will notice that when you read budget projections, you see projections not just for 2016, but 17, 18, and when it's done better for 19, 20 as well. So really, it is an occasion for government to formulate the expectations of business and society about the direction and the road that we are taking ahead. And yet, especially when it comes to the act of projecting forward, what we noticed is that budgets don't act as governance or planning documents. They act as sometimes perhaps more like political documents. We know that when a political party presents a manifesto, that it is really looking to appeal to the short-term popularity of people's sentiments. And so budgets also can end up sometimes veering towards a political manifesto rather than actually a professional governance document. So a simple example of this is the way in which governments predict revenue in every budget. And I'm just looking at it from 2006. All these graphs show you that the different colors are for different sets of projections that are presented through budgets in different years. There's a set of projections in gray, in yellow, in green, in black, in blue, in red. These all occur at different periods or start periods. And you notice that in every set of projections, the government projects an upward increase, that revenue as a percentage of GDP will increase. Yet the red line shows you the actual direction in which revenue as a percentage of GDP has taken. It has decreased. It has gone in exactly the opposite direction. So there's a projection that sets one expectation, and there's a reality that moves, not just falls short of projection, but moves exactly in the opposite direction, creating a significant mismatch in terms of the expectations that the government tries to create and the habit that business and society gains to say that we become cynical of projections of government because they tend not to be met. So I think when we understand that this is how budgets have been made, unless something changes significantly, there's a serious problem in using what is said in budgets year on year as means of setting expectations for the future. Now, there are knock-on effects of making poor projections, because it's like making poor plans or failing to plan properly. They say that when you fail to plan, you plan to fail. Okay? So not understanding how revenue is actually going to go forward sets the government up to create short-term revenue crunchers that then have to be met with short-term solutions. So you see that last year, actually in the 2015, the revenue would have been a great deal less January to September, if not for some short-term fixes that allowed or created the environment for the import of a large number of vehicles. So on the right-hand side, you see how vehicle registration ballooned in this period because of the different incentives provided through taxation. And the orange bar on the left shows you that the variance in expected taxes versus collected taxes from various categories of taxes. So total revenue still fell short, right? But revenue from motor vehicles was almost 80% in excess of what was expected. Excise special provision revenue, which also is put on trade, was about over 30% more than what was expected. So really these using trade taxes and incentives to import more, which also creates problems with the trade deficit, which I'll discuss later, becomes a short-term fix that makes up for poor planning in the past and yet doesn't fully compensate for the problem of meeting revenue targets. I think the reason I've titled this that politics trumps professionalism is that a professional assessment of the opportunities for taxation in the country should and could reveal that there are other areas of taxation in which the government can sustainably and reasonably collect a great deal more, but is failing to do so. I'm going to take the example of taxation on cigarettes, because the government effectively through taxation sets both the price and taxes on cigarettes, and see what has happened to that. I'm looking at data from 1981. So from 1981 all the way up to the year 2000, even though it didn't happen in a smooth way, taxes in cigarettes have been adjusted in keeping with the increase in per capita GDP. For 20 years, effectively the government maintained the ability or the habit of coming back and ensuring that the total increase in excise taxes matched the affordability or income growth in the country. But from 2000 onwards, the system or the bureaucratic system, the tax assessment system has failed to do so. So for 20 years, what was affordable on per capita income was 9,542 cigarettes. Today, a per capita income can afford 15,831 cigarettes, which means there's a great deal more room to tax and increase the price of cigarettes. The failure of the bureaucracy to understand this, and often contrary assessments and analysis saying that the revenue will dry up because cigarettes people will decrease consumption if prices go up, turned out to be proved quite flatly wrong this year, when actually after some time, cigarette consumption actually increased significantly in all 3 quarters of this year. The tax that is actually collectible on a proper pricing and increase of cigarettes can increase by about another 50 billion rupees. Obviously, that can't be done overnight and would have to be done gradually, but that is the cost of failure to professionally assess, calculate, and calibrate taxes on an ongoing basis. And yet, then you have these short-term measures that are there to plug revenue. So really, there is a serious issue of how the bureaucracy, I think the public sector professionalism, is functioning, because this is not only about politics, finally, it is also about the capacity and competence of Sri Lanka's public sector. So you see here that, again, budget deficit targets are not met, but significantly and importantly, Sri Lanka has been on a path of reducing its budget deficits. I think what I want to highlight here is that the incentives that politicians and the country faces are not simply local. I think the LBR LBO forum, by inviting so many speakers from outside and talking about geopolitics, talking about the international environment, is doing the right thing in signaling that the outlook for the country, we don't live in that sense in an isolated spot in the world. We are affected by what's going on, and global incentives matter in various ways. Here, simply, Sri Lanka is moving from concessionary borrowing to non-concessionary borrowing. And when you move to non-concessionary borrowing, the ratings really matter. And budget deficits really matter for ratings. And that pressure has been felt for some time now in the country, at least for the last 5-6 years. And that has been helping to drive budget deficits down. When borrowing was concessionary and easy, 80s, 90s, we saw budget deficits ballooning out of control. But now there is a check on that, because the incentives that are created internationally. The problem, of course, of local political incentives, working properly or improperly, is that the way in which these budget deficits have been cut ideally would have been by finding sustainable professional ways to increase revenue. But actually, the way in which they have been cut is by cutting expenditure quite drastically. So you all know the campaigns that in the past complained about the cut in health expenditure, cut in education expenditure. But also, you'd be quite surprised to know that in 2010 to 2015, there were significant cuts against the budget on agriculture and irrigation expenditure. One year they were cut 10%, another year 20%, 32 or 35%, and in 2014, as much as more than 60% of that budget was cut. While other political priorities like defense expenditure was hardly cut. Okay? So in a situation where there is no accountability, where there is no analysis of whether the government did what it said, I began by talking about how budget documents can read like political manifestos. And also in Sri Lanka, we don't hold governments to their manifesto after they're elected, or not very much. We are probably doing it better over time. But the manifesto gets forgotten after the election is over. So often, the budget projections, the budget promises, except when it is clear welfare disbursements, when it's regard to spending that is invisible, can very easily be forgotten after the budget is over. And when the numbers are available, when the next time's budget is published, then nobody bothers analyzing it and holding government to account. The discussion is all about this year's budget. If I can get some water. Yeah. So this is very important, that what we noticed was that the cutting of the deficit didn't happen in a way that necessarily was helpful to the long-term development of the country and the sectors that needed investment. Just to kind of end this cycle of discussion, you can see the political cycles of the budget. What's in blue at the bottom actually shows you the budget discipline in political cycles, and the blue line shows you the budget deficit. And you can see that in cycles, there's a significant period in which the budget deficit is reduced and improved, but just before an election, the budget deficit balloons. Another cycle of improving the budget deficit or reducing it, just before an election, a budget deficit balloons. So there's a lot of predictability in a perverse way in how government manages its finances, the cycles of how the economic activity is related to actually the political incentives and political activity. So 2014 and 2015 also, we've had the same problem of very high pressure on the fiscal side and expenditure, simply driven by the imperatives of elections, in which there are no mechanisms in the country, there are no laws that prevent the busting of budgets on things that were just not even planned, and in ways that were not planned in a very short space of time. So progress made over a long period of time can be lost quite quickly by busting up money during election cycles. And clearly there is the importance of having some kind of regulatory legislative ability to curtail those perverse political incentives, because politicians are invariably rewarded for this misbehavior rather than punished or held to account, and that's a systemic problem in the way our budgeting and economic and political system operates. So just looking at government debt, okay, the debt targets, I want to talk about something else that's important in terms of economic planning. You notice that we pay a lot of attention to how much is the debt and how is the debt actually changing over time. And what percentage of GDP is debt? Is it come down by 5%, gone up by 3%? This is all very important and very good to do, and these numbers show you how, even though we are not keeping up with the plans, debt has been, as a percentage of GDP, has been coming down slowly. The problem is that there are some debts that are not even calculated, are completely invisible in budgeting and accounting. For instance, the public service pension is a huge debt that the government accrues year by year. When the public sector increased in the last 5 years from about 800,000 to 1.3 million or more, and from a little less than 800,000, it close to doubled. It is not just the salaries that are paid out to the public sector that are important, it is the debt liability that is accruing invisibly. That's because we have a pension scheme in which there is no obligation to do the notional accounting of the debt that is accrued for the future by pension promises made today, right? So if you have a system in which you can make promises today that bring you votes, and somebody else, not even you, has 20 years later has the headache and burden of making good on those promises, then clearly you're going to start making promises that are probably unsustainable or unwise, because those are the incentives that you face. That's basic understanding of how incentives work, right? In Sri Lanka, there's no publication of how much the pension debt is as a percentage of GDP. And whenever pension increases are announced, there's no obligation on government to actually say what is the future cost and present discounted cost of that debt, of that announcement. There should be. So, the best calculations that Verite has managed to make sets the current pension debt at about 25% of GDP. That is, it's like servicing in perpetuity a debt of 25% of GDP, which takes Sri Lanka's total debt close to 100% in reality, in effect. So the effective debt to GDP ratio is much higher. And yet, because of also weaknesses in how global accounting and even IMF monitoring works, there is no necessity to actually internalize this cost, which is basically just like any other debt, a cost on future taxes, right? And therefore, there's very poor planning and adjustment on this. So I think the point is that moving towards a more professional way of managing the economy should make it mandatory to at least publish the present discounted value estimates of pension debts, and to publish actually revenue and expenditure consequences of all government promises in budgets. That promises on budgetary changes in expenditure or changes in policy should always come to Parliament with an estimate of the revenue or expenditure consequence tabled by a professional independent calculation. Without it, how is Parliament, how are economists to make sensible decisions for the future of the country? I will shift to a section that is much more political in its analysis, though I will keep using economic data. And I want to talk about the new situation that we're in, the new government, the new political and policy balance, okay? You will have to tell me when I have 10 minutes left, Lakshman, so I can hurry up. Let me use as an example, just to motivate this discussion, what happened recently with permits that were given to, that have become a sort of entitlement. Even though there's nowhere in the public service contracts that public servants are entitled to free vehicle permits every 5 years, just through the practice and habituation of it over long cycles, where political incentives drove those for electoral reasons, they have become entrenched as a kind of concept of entitlement. So before the budget, public servants were felt they were entitled to a vehicle permit every 5 years. The budget proposed that it will be abolished, vehicle permits, and that they will not be granted. The first compromise that occurred, and we'll talk later about how the compromises occurred, was to give public servants 1 million in place of a vehicle permit. The second compromise that offered was to give them 2 permits in 10 years, which is exactly the same thing as 1 permit every 5 years, okay? So it was still presented as somehow a face-saving compromise, right? Now what's going on there? There was a decision, there was a discussion, and there was a complete reversal of the decision. I want to leave a question mark with regard to whether this tells us something about the nature of democracy that both our politicians and our business world are not fully coming to grips with, okay? So this happened on lots of other things, and they have revenue consequences, and I'll just slip over this slide. So you can see that emissions levy was applied to all vehicles, then it was taken off 2-wheelers, it was taken off 3-wheelers, left only on 4-wheelers. And the problem is none of us are now quite clear what the latest budget estimates are for expenditure and revenue, because these changes in policy have massive revenue consequences, right? Let me present this picture to you, that the new political situation we are in has 3 centers of gravity in terms of political power, okay? Now, in my PowerPoint slide, these start moving around as well, but this is a PDF, okay? And it's important to understand the new political balance, or the new political situation, as consisting of these 3 centers of gravity, okay? In the past, we thought that Parliament was really, where debate and discussion and decision-making compromise should arise. But often we found that as long as a government controlled a significant majority of Parliament, sometimes 2/3, but even less, that Parliament in Sri Lanka, 10 minutes left, had become quite, not very effective. that Parliament was not acting as an adequate check on executive power and decision making. So yes, we had an election every 6 years, but between elections, governments felt that they could do what they liked and somehow recover popularity in an election year by busting budgets and increasing deficits, as I have showed you. So the responsive function of democracy wasn't working very well. The interesting thing about today's political balance is that actually cabinet itself has two centers of gravity that are invariably in competition with each other. Okay? And in a sense, you have something that most political theorists and businesses think is a bad thing, which is you have a sense weak government. A lot of people in Sri Lanka want to have Lee Kuan Yew, want to have authoritarian, powerful executive because they think, powerful executive can get things done and deliver to us. And weak government can't make decisions, can't deliver. I want to suggest an alternative way of looking at politics. I want to suggest, and I will say that this is not just from Sri Lankan history, I'll build it a little later, that weak government is better for democracy and better for long-term decision-making, provided, and I'll say what the proviso is a little later, okay? If you look at government since 1977, you will realize that when government is strong, policies and constitutional amendments passed mostly favored government, it did not favor people. Post-77 constitutional amendments mostly reduced the scope of democracy, didn't expand it. But when governments were weak, there were significant changes and amendments that benefited the potential for long-term structural reform. For instance, take the 17th Amendment to the Constitution, which everybody wanted, and in fact changed the government to bring back the 17th Amendment in many ways. That came at a time when President Chandrika Kumaratunga was at her weakest, struggling to hold on to a parliamentary majority. She agreed to pass the 17th Amendment. The 18th Amendment passes when the government is at its strongest. The 19th Amendment comes when the government does not even have a majority, or the UMP doesn't have a majority in parliament. Why do they pass? Because when government is weak, more than ever, the competition between different factions of parliament and government force them to legitimize themselves in the public domain in a way that they are not forced to legitimize themselves apart from an election year under normal democratic functioning in Sri Lanka. So the fact that weak government has to be sensitive and responsive to public concern is the huge opportunity for democracy that is created by weak government. Parliament has a long history in the world. It starts with the Magna Carta in 1215 in England. The concept of a king has always had two traditions historically. One is that the king is the sovereign, like God, that the king sets the rules and the subjects follow the rules. There is a competing concept of kingship that says the king is a steward, that the rules that exist outside the king, they exist with maybe deity or God. And the king is also subject to the rules just like anybody else. But too much strong government, too much political authority has always veered in the direction of the king trying to take the place of God. But in 1215, King John is a weak king. And the nobles get together and force him to sign what's called the Magna Carta, which is now known as the foundation of parliamentary democracy, which is really a way of binding the king, not just to be subject to the laws, but also subject to consultation and consensus building in society, that he has to at least consult with his nobles and the rest of those affected before he increases taxes, before he declares war. The king agrees to the Magna Carta in 1215 and promptly calls up the Pope. Of course, there's no telephone, but he calls up the Pope and says, let's abrogate this. And within a year, they abrogate the Magna Carta because the king wants to reassert power. Strangely enough, the Pope and the king both pass away within a year. And the new king is the son of King John, 9 years old, and he's extremely weak, and he has to solidify support in the society, so the Magna Carta is reissued. So all through England's history, you see the Magna Carta getting reissued because the king is weak, and he needs to get public support. Finally, with Cromwell and etc., this gets entrenched in Parliament. Par means to converse in Latin. So democracy as government by discussion gets entrenched precisely when the opportunity of a weak king arises and creates the space for doing so. So I think the lesson for business, I think, is this, that when you have a strong king, when you have strong government, all you need to know is have a good relationship with that strong king. A good relationship with the key decision makers, and there are about 5 usually, right? And if you can get them on your side, then it's easy. This is how you do business. This is how you get policy changed. This is how you get incentives set up or regulations set up to favor your industry. In the modern world, that's the cheap way of succeeding at business. The tough way of succeeding at business, and the really competitive way, the one that gives you global competitiveness, is the ability to work within rules and regulations that are fair by all, and also to be able to bring about positive change through creating public dialogue. So many people in business come and tell me, Nishan, hasn't things become very confusing and very uncertain? I mean, who do you talk to now? Right? Because the old mindset of how business could be done, how policy could be influenced, still pervades the new situation, in which actually the ability to change public consciousness, to champion things publicly, to create a discussion about important policy changes for the country can become the leverage point. So politicians are also learning this, because the government in many of its budget proposals was acting under older instincts. There was no public conversation created about why public servants should lose their permits. There was no public conversation created about why Sri Lanka should move from a provident fund to a pension system, even though it might be a good idea. And obviously, there's huge resistance to these because they're seen as elite decision-making by the king who thinks he's sovereign and is unable to engage through discussion and convincing discussion in the public sphere. But if I can guarantee you, the day that Sri Lankan society believes that public servants don't deserve permits, public service will not get permits. Maybe they deserve permits, they certainly deserve higher salaries and a whole restructuring of the incentives in the public sector. But you can't simply decide in a closed room amongst 10 people that this is a jolly good idea, that all my friends who are economists are around here and they're giving me the same advice, and I can run ahead and do policy. That doesn't fit the democracy. And the current situation of weak government really forces. So you can see why the current situation is like that. These are just numbers, that even though we think that the unity government controls 2/3 of parliament, between the two centers of gravity, they don't control 2/3 of parliament. They do control a majority. And these centers of gravity are vulnerable because the outer orbits of each can very well in certain times move and join another orbit, as we know, has happened in Parliament quite often, okay? So this is a new balance, and I think it's important to understand it. So my time is probably catching up, okay? So let me just run through some things on currency management and trade that also explain these political dynamics a little bit better. Look at what happens in Sri Lanka's currency between the presidential election and the general election. The currency stays mostly flat for 9 months, okay, or 8 months, and then suddenly increases in September after the election. What's going on? We know that politically in Sri Lankan society, the way in which economic ideas have been percolated says that currency, the value of your currency is a sign of your virility. Economic virility and the strength of currency are somehow brought together mistakenly, right? I mean, all you got to do is look at the Korean won. It takes more than 1,000 won to buy $1. Is the Korean economy weaker than Sri Lanka? Certainly not. So the amount of your currency that you exchange for a US dollar is not a sign of virility, but that's what the public thinks. And that's how the political criticism builds up. So therefore, before the election, it was not possible to allow the currency to adjust, but you pent up all that suppressed pressure and let it go suddenly, which is, of course, terrible in terms of business planning, confidence of the international community, etc., when your currency adjustments are not smooth. And you can see how driving growth through trade deficits, and I won't dwell on this slide, also puts pressure on your currency eventually, and that's economic pressure. I want to just jump to this slide to show you that the problem is not just political. On the top side, you see how political cycles can really create step-ups in currency. On the bottom, you see that volatility managed sometimes quite poorly. All the lines that you see are occasions in which the monthly volatility is more than 1%. Now, there is no problem in the currency adjusting if you manage it in a way that the adjustment of the currency offsets the interest rate differential that Sri Lanka has over the US dollar. So maybe you can get 5% extra on a Sri Lankan, or 6% extra on a Sri Lankan rupee over US dollar, whatever it is. As long as the currency is depreciating more slowly, it is not better to hold US dollars. It's better to hold Sri Lankan rupees. The problem is when you're depreciating the currency at 1% a month, that's 12%. Clearly, everybody is trying to figure out when these volatile depreciations are going to take place and are going to try speculating. But the role of the central bank or professional management of the currency is really to manage a much more smoother path of currency depreciation that doesn't create incentives for capital flight. But from the 1990s onwards, the central bank has been really quite poor at that. And these numbers just show you the evidence, right? So many people thought just because the currency is held strongly stable against the US dollar, that's great. It is not great because it just means that you're going to jump up one day and everybody's going to have speculative issues around when that's going to happen, okay? I will end by talking about the pressures on inflation, interest rate, and the prospects for growth. You can see that while inflation has been coming down, food and non-food inflation has been going in different direction, but core inflation is not coming down anymore, and that presents somewhat of a pressure or implication for interest rates going forward. And the liquidity, the excess liquidity that the country had for quite a long period, and we talked about it last year, is also gotten mopped up, which is again a sign that that average lending rates can't keep falling, and there may be pressure to increase average lending rates. Right? When you look at net dollar purchases, even in October, you can see that the currency is still under some pressure, and there's all the concern about what's going to happen to the US dollar. Is the US dollar interest rates going to go up? And obviously, these have implications which you all know, and I don't have to dwell on. Right? The other factor that has affected both exchange rates and then by implication interest rates, because if you want to hold your exchange rate steady, you either have to have net inflows or you have to increase your interest rates. So you have to know those relationships. That Sri Lanka in the last couple of years has been trying to depend less on foreign borrowing. So this is very much like being on a half-inflated boat and trying to get the air out. When you press on one side, it inflates on another side. And exchange rate, interest rate, inflation, debt, foreign debt are all connected in a way that simple short-term political fixes isn't going to deliver long-term results. And the short-term political fixes Sri Lanka has had regularly in terms of its growth path is to boost growth on import trade and consumption imports, and in the last 5 years on construction. So what this graph shows you is really the way in which most of the post-war growth dividend that we saw came from construction. Most of it. It came from import trade as well, but in boom and bust cycles, right? Like this. So because when the trade deficit balloons, you have to slap down imports, and then you have a bust cycle. Then you let it balloon again, and that trade deficit was really around consumption goods. Import trade was mostly consumption goods, which again is not very sustainable. And you can see how in 2015, we are back to growing on import trade. So construction didn't grow. This is the first quarters of 2015 and 14, or first half. You can see what grew faster than last year, this year in 2015, is import trade. It's on a boom cycle. Construction didn't grow as fast. So you're looking at, again, in 2016, at least the second part, a bust cycle for import trade. I know my time is up. These are the projections by different organizations with regard to countries' growth prospects. But let me end by saying this, that long-term prospects for Sri Lanka depend on solving long-standing problems, okay? But what we see by examining government policy and economic variables is that the tendency or the temptation is always to solve short-term problems and solve them in short cycles, right? And that's not going to cut it in terms of putting Sri Lanka on a new optimistic path that everybody wants to project. The long-term issues, I mean, there are many. One is actually the quality of Sri Lanka's bureaucracy and its professionalism. Can it cope with the kind of professional inputs and abilities that are required for a middle-income economy? And what is the change that you need to see in the bureaucracy to achieve that? It's also about the fact that agriculture has 30% of the labor force, but produces only 10% of GDP. There's a large amount of Sri Lanka's labor force stuck in unproductive agriculture. Converting a structural conversion into productive agriculture takes real thought and work. And Sri Lankan labor is opting out of work in Sri Lanka, and if either they're stuck in unproductive agriculture or they're opting out and going to low-skilled jobs or semi-skilled jobs outside the country. So the problem that we face with regard to unlocking or attracting our labor force in a viable way into higher productivity, higher wages that keep them in Sri Lanka is a problem that has to be tackled. And of course, if you looked at all my slides on exchange rate, all that, you realize that if you're not growing exports, which have been declining over the years, then our macroeconomic issues are going to become stronger. But growing exports is not simply about helping a few large companies export. Less than 5% of Sri Lanka's small and medium sector contribute less than 5% to exports. That's much lower than most countries. Export and foreign direct investment depend on the ability of a country to provide a large number of small players to which jobs and production processes can be outsourced. And if those small players are not flourishing and emerging in the country, then the prospects for attracting investment are actually low, and lower than people think. So let me end by saying that we are not yet in that political cycle where we're solving some of the bigger issues have been made politically important. So if my analysis of weak government is right, these changes will not come by backdoor lobbying because they're inconvenient politically. They will come when there's a social and a wider business level consciousness that government must deliver on these structural changes. And if that consciousness and that wider legitimacy for these changes are not created, then we can't expect them out of our political system. Strong government has never delivered it. A weak government can, but it really depends on what the business associations, civil society, academics do in terms of shaping the priority and discourses for government in the year to head. Thank you very much. Yeah.
LBR LBO Debrief, Business Climate Outlook of 2016.